I genuinely believe Final Fantasy VII has the greatest story in the entire Final Fantasy series. Even decades later, very few games have managed to create the same emotional impact, atmosphere, mystery, and psychological depth that FF7 delivered back in 1997. As a child, this was one of those rare games I could play for months without ever getting bored. Every time I turned on the PlayStation, it felt like there was always something new waiting for me. A hidden area, a mysterious character, a shocking plot twist, a strange enemy, a secret materia. The world of Final Fantasy VII constantly rewarded curiosity and exploration in a way very few games ever have. To me, this is one of those games every gamer should experience at least once in their life. So today, let's take a deep dive into the dark world of Midgar, Sephiroth, Shinra, and the game that changed the RPG genre forever. I'm Barak from Retro Game Stories. When people talk about the most important video games ever made, certain names always appear. Super Mario Bros. Changed platform gaming. Doom revolutionized first-person shooters. Ocarina of Time redefined 3D adventure games. But few games transformed the entire perception of gaming itself the way Final Fantasy VII did. Released in 1997 for the original PlayStation, Final Fantasy VII was not simply a successful RPG. It became a cultural moment. It was one of the first games to convince millions of people that video games could tell cinematic, emotional, and psychologically complex stories on the same level as films. Today, cinematic storytelling in gaming feels normal. Massive cutscenes, emotional character arcs, orchestral music, and dark themes exist everywhere. But in the late 1990s, that level of ambition was shocking. Final Fantasy VII helped create that future. To understand why the game became so revolutionary, it's important to understand the gaming landscape before its release. During the early and mid-1990s, Nintendo dominated the console market. The Super Nintendo was hugely successful, and role-playing games mostly remained associated with Japanese audiences. While games like Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI received critical praise, RPGs were still considered niche outside Japan. At the same time, Sony entered the gaming industry with the PlayStation. Unlike Nintendo, Sony believed CDs represented the future of gaming technology. CDs offered significantly larger storage capacity compared to cartridges. This allowed developers to include full-motion videos, orchestrated soundtracks, larger worlds, and more ambitious storytelling. Square immediately recognized this opportunity. Originally, Final Fantasy VII had early conceptual development tied to Nintendo hardware, but Square ultimately made a historic decision. They abandoned Nintendo and partnered with Sony exclusively. This was one of the most important business decisions in gaming history. Final Fantasy VII became the perfect showcase for the PlayStation's CD technology. The game launched across 3 discs, which immediately gave players the impression they were experiencing something enormous and cinematic. And then came the opening sequence. Even today, the introduction remains iconic. The game begins quietly with Aerith standing beside a leaking Mako pipe in Midgar. The camera slowly pulls backward, revealing an enormous industrial city illuminated by green energy. Suddenly, the music explodes as a train races through the city and Cloud jumps into action. This sequence changed expectations for what games could feel like. The presentation resembled cinema, but unlike a film, players actively controlled the experience. The transition between cinematic scenes and gameplay felt seamless for its time. Final Fantasy VII created immersion on a level many players had never experienced before. But technical ambition alone was not the reason the game became legendary. The true reason was its themes. Final Fantasy VII explored ideas rarely discussed in games during the 1990s. Environmental destruction, corporate exploitation, class inequality, psychological trauma, identity crises, and existential fear. At the center of these themes stood Midgar. Midgar is arguably one of the greatest fictional cities in gaming history because it represents far more than just a setting. The city itself acts as a symbol of industrial greed and societal collapse. The Shinra Electric Power Company controls Midgar entirely. Shinra is not merely a corporation. It essentially functions as a government, military force, and global superpower simultaneously. The company extracts Mako energy directly from the planet to fuel civilization. However, Mako is not just energy. The game repeatedly explains that Mako represents the planet's life force itself. This detail transforms the entire moral foundation of the story. Shinra is literally draining the planet alive in exchange for technological advancement and economic growth. For a 1997 video game, this environmental message was remarkably bold. Midgar visually reinforces these themes through its design. The wealthy citizens live above the city on massive metal plates where sunlight still exists. Meanwhile, the poor survive underneath in polluted slums filled with darkness, rust, and industrial decay. The upper city physically blocks the sky from the lower class. This imagery serves as one of the clearest visual metaphors in gaming history for economic inequality and systemic oppression. What makes Midgar especially powerful is how believable it feels. Although it is fictional, its themes reflect real-world anxieties about environmental collapse, unchecked capitalism, and social division. These themes remain relevant decades later, which is one reason Final Fantasy VII continues to resonate with modern audiences. The game's darker themes become even more disturbing through Shinra's scientific experiments. One of the most important elements of the story is the Genova Project. Years before the events of the game, Shinra scientists discovered the remains of an extraterrestrial life form called Genova. Initially, researchers mistakenly believed Genova belonged to the Ancients, a mysterious ancient civilization connected to the planet. In reality, Genova was a parasitic alien organism responsible for destroying civilizations. Instead of eliminating this threat, Shinra scientists began experimenting with Genova's cells. Human subjects were injected with these cells in hopes of creating genetically enhanced super soldiers. This experimentation ultimately created Sephiroth. Sephiroth remains one of gaming's most iconic villains because he embodies both power and tragedy. At first, players only hear rumors about him. He is described as a legendary soldier operative and war hero whose abilities border on supernatural. This limited exposure builds mystery around the character. However, Final Fantasy VII gradually reveals the horrifying truth behind Sephiroth's existence. He was never allowed a normal identity or childhood. His life was shaped entirely by experimentation, manipulation, and secrecy. When Sephiroth eventually learns the truth about Genova and his origins, his entire sense of identity collapses. This psychological breakdown becomes central to the game's narrative. Unlike many villains from the era, Sephiroth is not simply evil for the sake of being evil. He represents the consequences of corporate experimentation, emotional isolation, and manufactured identity. This complexity made him far more memorable than traditional antagonists. The Nibelheim incident remains one of the most psychologically disturbing moments in the game. During this flashback sequence, Sephiroth discovers hidden research documents explaining the truth behind the Genova Project. He isolates himself inside the Shinra Mansion library for days while obsessively reading scientific reports. When he finally emerges, he no longer behaves rationally. He concludes that humanity betrayed him and that he possesses a superior destiny connected to Genova. Soon afterward, he destroys the town of Nibelheim in an act of rage and madness. This sequence dramatically changes the tone of the game. What initially appeared to be a fantasy adventure suddenly transforms into psychological horror. Fire consumes homes while civilians desperately flee for survival. The imagery remains emotionally effective because it emphasizes loss and emotional devastation rather than spectacle alone. Final Fantasy VII consistently approached storytelling with emotional seriousness uncommon in games of its era. No moment demonstrates this more clearly than Aerith's death. Today, Aerith's death is widely recognized as one of gaming's most famous scenes, but its original impact in 1997 cannot be overstated. Modern audiences live in an era dominated by spoilers, social media, and online leaks. In the late 1990s, however, many players experienced the scene without prior knowledge. Aerith was not treated like a temporary side character. She was emotionally important, narratively central, and mechanically useful in combat. Many players assumed she would remain part of the story permanently. Instead, Sephiroth kills her suddenly and without warning. The scene shocked audiences because of its simplicity. There is no elaborate final speech or dramatic cinematic battle beforehand. Her death occurs quickly and permanently. For many players, this was the first time a video game created genuine emotional grief. The impact extended far beyond the scene itself. Players searched for hidden methods to revive Aerith for years afterward. Gaming magazines, early internet forums, and rumor communities spread countless fake secrets and conspiracy theories about alternate endings. None of them were true. Aerith remained dead permanently. That permanence mattered enormously because it demonstrated that video game stories could embrace irreversible emotional consequences. Another reason Final Fantasy VII became historically significant was its atmosphere and audiovisual design. Nobuo Uematsu's soundtrack remains one of the greatest musical achievements in gaming history. Each area of the game possesses a distinct emotional identity through music alone. Midgar's industrial tension, Aerith's haunting theme, and Sephiroth's intimidating musical presence all contribute to emotional immersion. Music in Final Fantasy VII does not merely accompany gameplay. It actively shapes emotional interpretation. The visual design also contributed heavily to the game's influence. Although the polygonal character models now appear outdated, the artistic direction remains highly effective. The combination of pre-rendered backgrounds, industrial architecture, and dystopian environments created a world unlike anything most players had previously seen. The game constantly balanced beauty and horror. Ancient temples, abandoned laboratories, alien entities, ruined towns, and spiritual imagery combined to create an atmosphere of mystery and unease. This atmosphere became essential to the identity of Final Fantasy VII. Another groundbreaking aspect of the game was its treatment of identity and memory through Cloud Strife. Initially, Cloud appears to fit the traditional cool and confident RPG protagonist archetype. However, the story slowly reveals that Cloud himself barely understands who he truly is. His memories are fragmented and unreliable. Some memories belong to him, others belong to Zack Fair. Some were psychologically reconstructed following trauma and experimentation. This narrative twist was highly unusual for gaming narratives at the time. Instead of presenting a stable heroic identity, Final Fantasy VII forces both the player and protagonist to question reality itself. Cloud's identity crisis adds psychological depth rarely seen in 1990s gaming narratives. Importantly, Final Fantasy VII also succeeded because it maintained emotional humanity despite its large-scale science fiction themes. The story constantly focuses on emotionally damaged individuals struggling to survive in a collapsing world. Barrett struggles with guilt and revenge. Tifa struggles with memory and emotional connection. Cloud struggles with identity. Aerith carries the burden of an ancient civilization. Even the antagonists are shaped by emotional pain and manipulation. These human struggles ground the story emotionally, preventing the game from becoming emotionally distant despite its fantastical elements. Final Fantasy VII's influence on the gaming industry cannot be overstated. The game demonstrated that RPGs could achieve mainstream international success. It proved that players would embrace emotionally serious storytelling. It normalized cinematic presentation in games and encouraged developers to treat video games as narrative experiences rather than purely mechanical entertainment. Countless franchises owe some degree of influence to Final Fantasy VII, including Mass Effect, Persona, Kingdom Hearts, Xenoblade Chronicles, and many modern cinematic RPGs. Its influence extended beyond role-playing games entirely. More importantly, Final Fantasy VII changed how audiences viewed gaming as an artistic medium. Before games like Final Fantasy VII, emotional storytelling in gaming was often underestimated. After Final Fantasy VII, developers increasingly pursued cinematic ambition, emotional narratives, and thematic complexity. Even today, the game remains culturally relevant because its fears still feel modern. Environmental collapse remains a global concern. Corporate power continues expanding. Economic inequality persists worldwide. Identity and psychological instability remain universal human struggles. Final Fantasy VII's themes never became outdated because they were rooted in real societal anxieties. That enduring relevance explains why the game continues to receive remakes, analysis videos, fan theories, and critical discussion nearly 30 years after release. Very few games achieve that level of permanence. Ultimately, Final Fantasy VII changed gaming forever because it arrived at the perfect historical moment. Technological innovation, cinematic ambition, emotional storytelling, psychological complexity, and social commentary combined into a single experience unlike anything audiences had previously seen. It was not simply a successful RPG. It was a turning point for the entire medium, and decades later, its influence still defines modern gaming. If you enjoyed this and want more deep dives like this, be sure to subscribe to Retro Game Stories. Every week, we revisit the games that shaped an entire generation and explore why they still matter today. And your opinion matters too. Drop a comment and tell me your experience with this game or which game you'd like to see next.